Hello and welcome to the latest NSF webinar. Today I'm going to talk about topics when auditing a high-speed packaging line. My name is Lynne Byers and I'm an Executive Director at NSF Health Sciences. I have a degree in chemistry and postgraduate diplomas in management and pharmaceutical QA. I'm also eligible to be an EU qualified person and also I'm an ERP certified auditor. And as you can see from my CV there, I've worked for 3 large companies, Novartis, GSK and UCB, and also Head of Inspectorate and Licensing for the MHRA. So in my very long career, I've performed many audits and been subject to many audits and inspections. So no matter what you're auditing, you should really think about what you're going to audit, and audits should always be risk-based. They should focus on areas of risk, not the easy areas. I think we've all seen inspectors or auditors who have their pet topics and will spend many, many hours on those pet topics, even though they may not be particular areas of risk. And with any audit, you need to plan how long you want to spend in the area, in the packaging area, and also, as with any production area, packaging area, you must actually visit the area and not just look at documents. So this slide is the packaging process flow. It's obviously a simplified version, but what I've done here is I've identified what I believe are the greatest areas of risk. So if you follow through from the top in the middle, you have the packaging materials receipt, and then moving through sampling, testing and receipt, and then moving through to dispensing and issuing to the packaging area. And this is an area that is of greater risk than actually doing the sampling or the testing and release. When you move through from that, you need to transfer to the packaging area, and taking materials onto line is one of the risky items. So are you taking them onto the correct line, making sure that all the data set up on the equipment is correct, and making sure that the packaging line is actually cleared and ready to use. And then moving through into the packaging process with the finished packs coming through with various in-process controls. They tend to be fairly well defined. And then at the end doing a reconciliation, the line clearance again, and return of the excess materials to stock. And clearly those are particular problem areas to make sure they go back to the right areas. So with any inspection or with any audit, you need to really consider what are the standards that you're using. And it's always really good idea to look at the standards and to make sure that you actually know what they say. This might seem very simple, but so many people work on maybe hearsay or what they think. It's actually really important to look at what are the standards and the regulations. And throughout this presentation, I've pulled out some of the key European requirements, and also in some call-out boxes I've put in some questions or areas that I believe auditors should look at. So as you can see in Chapter 3.25, the EU GMP says that printed packaging materials are considered critical to the conformity of the medicinal product, and special attention should be paid to the safe and secure storage of materials. So storage of materials is something we'll cover. And then 5.46 goes on to say particular attention should be paid to printed materials. They should be stored in adequately secure conditions as to exclude unauthorized access. And cut labels and other loose printed materials should be stored and transported in separate closed containers to avoid mix-ups. So what does good look like? Once you know what the standards are, you also have to know what actually is okay and what's not okay. So if you look at the control of the secure storage, then you clearly need to have access control to the warehouse. Warehouses will receive many deliveries every day, but it's important that any delivery drivers coming do not have access into the storage areas. In many warehouses, you'll see locked cages and cabinets for printed labels. or perhaps printed cartons and leaflets in the high racking, secure and out of reach. So if you walk into a warehouse, what do you look for? Often I've seen in warehouses one pallet might have multiple small boxes of different items, and clearly this is not well segregated. There may be locked cages, but are they left unlocked, and can anyone walk in? And are containers clearly labelled? So what controls are there within the warehouse? If you look at issuing of materials to the packaging area, many companies use computer systems, the enterprise systems such as SAP, and many warehouses today use barcode scanners, which actually helps to provide an independent check of what's actually been removed from the packaging warehouse area into the packaging area itself. So if you do not have a computerized system, then you will need independent checks to make sure that whatever is taken from the warehouse goes into the packaging area and is the appropriate material. So if you don't have a computer involved, then you will need two checks. If you have a computer involved, providing that is controlled properly, then you can have the operator as the first check and then perhaps a barcode reader as a second check. Then moving on to the packaging area layout, again you have here the references, so 3.15. What's really important here is to make sure that the areas are actually specifically designed and laid out to avoid mix-ups or cross-contamination. And in 5.49, when setting up a program for the packaging operations, particular attention should be given to minimizing the risk of cross-contamination, mix-ups or substitutions. And different products should not be packaged in close proximity unless there is physical segregation. Now, cross-contamination can come in many forms. It could be some sort of chemical cross-contamination, or it could be actually totally different substitution or mix-ups with products or with any of the packaging components. And again, some key questions that an auditor should ask is actually to review the staging of the materials and where this actually is. Are the areas clearly separated and labelled such that there could not be a mistake and take the wrong materials onto the wrong packaging line? This diagram shows a schematic of a packaging line, and particularly if a packaging line is taking bulk products such as oral solid dose tablets or capsules or perhaps granules, then you will typically see a primary area whereby the product is actually exposed and is then contained within its primary pack, and then going through into the secondary packaging area where you might have leafleting, labelling and cartoning. And often what you will see is that in the primary packaging area, that area has a higher class of air with the exposed product. And so one of the key questions here is the area where the product is exposed of an appropriate air standard. And it's not just about the particulates, it's also about the humidity and the temperature, and particularly humidity for oral solid dose products. Often you can have some quite sensitive products to moisture, and it's important that that's well controlled. And then the second thing to think about is actually the flow of product. The best designs move from one part of the packaging line and move sequentially through the room to the opposite side where the finished product is then moved to another warehouse. So you have staging areas at one end for the printed packaging materials and the bulk product coming through, and then at the far end you have pallets going off to the warehouse ready for perhaps distribution. And importantly is also to have the segregation and have barriers in place such that it's not easy for product leaflets, labels, cartons to move between the lines. Then looking at the actual facility, the premises, it's important to have smooth, cleanable and non-shedding surfaces, particularly if you have open product, and to also have a higher grade of air at point of fill, as I've already said. But don't forget the local dust extraction that may be required and air recirculation. And these are also important points to think about from a cross-contamination perspective. So don't forget to clean out any vacuum systems that you may have, or understand what controls there might be in place such that you don't get flow back of dust into perhaps the next batch. Again, looking at the actual standards for premises, it's very similar for most manufacturing facilities for medicinal products. Critically, there should be smooth surfaces, free from cracks, no open joints, and should not shed particulate matter, and should permit easy and effective cleaning and, if necessary, disinfection. And the production areas should be effectively ventilated with air control facilities, including temperature and humidity and filtration, appropriate to the products being handled. The other thing to say is to make sure that, for example, whatever you take into the area does not create particulates. So you will see, certainly where there is open product, you will see most companies will not permit wooden pallets to be present in that area, and they typically use maybe cardboard or plastic pallets. But generally, if you're auditing the premises, you should look at the general upkeep of the area. Remember, there will be typically many forklift trucks operating in packaging areas, and it's very easy for them to damage the floor or the walls and create breaks in the paint, which can also then go on to create actual particulates. So in summary, it's necessary to have secure storage of packaging materials. The issue of packaging materials to production is very important to make sure that you have excellent controls on making sure that the right material goes to the right line. And then actually just looking at the packaging area layout, the staging areas and Kanbans. Now a Kanban is, just for me to explain it briefly, is a system that was invented in Japan. And basically, if you have something where you need lots of it during the packaging process, and you don't have room perhaps on the packaging line itself for the full amount, let's say some cartons, for example, if you're making and packaging a very large batch, you may bring some of the cartons onto the packaging line initially, and then have some others within a Kanban, and then when you start to run out of the cartons, you then bring them from the Kanban, and then the Kanban is then filled up again from the warehouse. Don't forget the requirements for fabric of the facility, and also the general look and appearance of the facility is really important to make sure that things look in order, that they are organised, they're clean, and there is standardisation in the area. So you've brought the materials onto line. What about the actual operation of a packaging line? Well, here, if you think about what are the risk areas, certainly packaging lines have many devices to check for things like missing overprints, missing leaflets, or incorrect coding in terms of, say, batch coding or expiry dating. And the high speed packaging lines have many such devices, and they're quite complicated, and particularly when they're running very fast, it's very easy to be mesmerized by them. But what's really important is that you look and check, and perhaps ask the staff if they could perform some checks to prove that it is picking up errors, and the unit is working correctly. And also, most importantly, that it's actually rejecting the correct item. So it might identify an error, but making sure that it actually rejects that unit that has the error is very important. And then secondly, what you see a lot on packaging lines is a question mark about handling of rejects. So what is the control of rejects? So if anything goes into the reject bin from any of these devices, are they totally rejected, or is there any sort of rework that is happening? And so thinking about the risks in terms of rework, the potential to possibly introduce problem items into the packaging line, you need to really think about that. And then looking at serialization. So serialization is now required in certainly in Europe and in several other countries around the world. And this has brought another complexity to packaging lines. And typically you have a 2D barcode that's printed onto each of the packs. And those 2D barcodes contain lots of information about and have individual item codes or individual codes. And it's important to understand how the codes come to the packaging line, how are they actually programmed into the online system, but then more importantly, how are samples and how are rejects actually managed such that they don't go into the various databases to suggest that they're available for a patient because they are no longer part of the batch which is provided to the market. So serialization is a risk area because it's relatively new, and it's an area that auditors should really look at. And then last but not least, in terms of the running of a packaging line, is actually just to stand back and watch and really think about, is the line running smoothly? Watch the operation of the line. Are the staff under pressure? Are they running from one end to the other? Are there any problem areas? So is the cartoner always jamming and causing problems, which leads to having to open the cartoner many times? And if you see that there are particular problem areas, it's worth going and looking more closely at that part of the line, because that will typically be an area of risk and where perhaps everything isn't defined exactly what needs to be done. So just watching for a few minutes without perhaps asking lots of questions can be a golden opportunity to see where there may be problems that you need to investigate. So then moving on to another area which is probably one of the greatest risk areas, and that is cleaning and line clearance. So a packaging process is a complicated process, and the nightmare scenario is that you have the wrong product or the wrong component on the packaging line, and that's called a rogue, or some companies call it a stranger or a foreigner. But effectively it's a GMP failure, and potentially quite a significant GMP failure, because if it's not found by the manufacturing company itself, the patient who takes this rogue product may not realize it's rogue and shouldn't be there, and could cause them some harm. So first, before you can do a line clearance, you need to think about the cleaning requirements of a packaging line. And the level of cleaning that is required is dependent upon the relationship of the packaging process with the preceding process. So, are there different products? Is it a different packaging process? Are there different strengths or different configurations? For example, 14s and 28s. Is it different markets? Or are there other items such as some markets may require tamper-evident labels or branded shipper tape? So all these items, these differences can result in different levels and requirements of cleaning. Looking at the regulatory requirements here, all of these regulations mention that before the packaging operations begin, checks and inspections of are clear of previous products and materials and so on, and checks must be carried out according to an appropriate checklist, and the checks have to be recorded and documented in the batch record. But what's a line clearance? So we've talked about cleaning already, so this is more the physical cleaning. Line clearance is removal of all the product, packaging components and documentation from one packaging batch or order, and anything else that's not required for the next packaging order, and clearing the packaging line equipment of the previous run. And also, most importantly, clearing the surrounding area of the previous run before the next packaging order is brought onto the line. So you should never have two packaging orders online at any one time. You need to completely remove the old order before you bring the next packaging order onto the line. And here's an auditor tip. It would be a really good idea to try and find time during the audit to observe a line clearance, because it's very easy to look at the documents, but to actually observe how thorough it is, how the line clearance is done by watching is better than just looking at a procedure. So, line clearance deviations. So, failure to complete and carry out a line clearance properly is a deviation from GMP. This has happened when we find that products or components from the previous batch, a rogue or a stranger, as I said, and these can be classified as critical, major or minor, or whatever the company chooses as their categories. But it should also be seen as an opportunity to carry out a detailed analysis and to improve. Now again, here's an auditor tip for you. Be very suspicious if a site has had no line clearance deviations. It would be very unusual never to have a line clearance deviation. Maybe they're finding things and not recording it in their deviation system, which clearly is against GMP. So these are some examples of our definitions for minor, major or critical. So a minor line clearance deviation could be, for example, the leaflet found in the bottom of the machine. It's very low patient risk as it could not get into the finished product. A major could be the product on a surface above the belt. A medium patient risk as a reasonable chance of the rogue being packaged. Or critical would be something like a tablet in a feed hopper, which would be a high risk as the rogue could easily have been packaged. So why is it so difficult to do a proper line clearance? Well, if you look at it, line clearances, to do them properly, actually take quite a long time. And humans lose concentration, so this just shows that after a time we start to see what we expect to see, that is nothing, and therefore you become very complacent and perhaps don't search and don't look very carefully and expect to find anything. Also, it's quite a difficult task. It's repetitive. You have to get torches, mirrors, and things like that. You have to open all the doors to the machines. And sometimes there's insufficient detail in the checklists or the procedures or the training of people. And poor lighting or actually badly designed equipment can make it really difficult. With more modern equipment, there's much greater awareness of having nicely designed equipment that you can easily see into the guts of the machine. But some of the old equipment is very difficult to see, and therefore it makes the job quite difficult to do. So, how do you actually perform a line clearance? So you need to think about what is your line. Now this might sound very simple, but actually you need to think about the line equipment and all the walls within whatever you define as your packaging line or your packaging area. And that includes engineering or spare parts cupboards, tool chests, desks, trolleys, deblistering machines, and every location within the four walls must be checked. And obviously it's really important to have as little clutter as possible, because it's very difficult to clean where there's clutter. And looking at equipment design, particularly if you find a problem where you find some rogues that you weren't expecting, say a while after you performed the line clearance, really consider, well, is it possible to have an engineering design such that it reduces the risk of any future rogues appearing in the equipment. The procedure should be to detail how to clean and how to check. There should be checklists to document the cleaning, with obviously columns for checking. There shouldn't be too many signatures, but what's important is to identify hotspots, so areas where problems are likely to occur. And here are some: so incomplete clearance of coding data, so that you start your next batch with the previous batch's batch identification, carton and leaflet feeders, tablet filling areas, and reject bins and samples left perhaps on the desk. And here are just some photographs of areas. These are in the primary packaging areas where you can have problems, and then again in the secondary areas. So anywhere where there are small gaps. Remember, in the secondary area you're handling things like leaflets, labels, cartons. Certainly leaflets and labels can easily be left behind in the machine. Training, very, very important. So management has to obviously make sure that staff are trained appropriately. They need to continue training, and the practical effectiveness should be periodically assessed. Now, some companies have employed a system where dummy rogues are put in, or sometimes it's called live line clearance, whereby you know that you're expecting to find something, so people have to make a note of where they've actually put the dummy rogues, and then really you can assess whether the operators actually find them or not. There should also be a periodic review of failures, and the use of video to train people in how to perform the various clearances, and the discussion about the hotspots. And also it's important to raise awareness and to look for improvements. This is just an example of a cleandown or line clearance record. So it's important that there is a record of every station, every point that's been checked, but you can actually sign off a group of activities when they're done by the same person at the same time. So that's the end of the webinar today on packaging materials. We only have one more this year, which is on this slide, and that's in December, how to resolve conflict within multinational organisations. So that's with Martin Lush on December the 17th, so please sign up for that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email. And also I want to really recognise that we have a pharmaceutical training programme with the link there. And also we have several e-learning trainings, including a new one on data integrity. And we also have a resource library, which is very useful. Most of the resources are free, so feel free to look at them and download items that may be of interest to you. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful and found some new tips for when you're auditing a packaging facility. And hope you have a good day. And thank you very much.